So usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute, like, uncompromising precision.
Right.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line fracturing the bone, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, you know, there it is, that's the failure point.
Yeah, the mechanism of injury is totally clear.
Exactly. The physics of the break are undeniable, and the path to fixing it is, well, it's purely mechanical.
It is a comforting binary, really. I mean, we have this innate psychological desire for things to be visible and, categorized,
Yeah.
subject to the immutable laws of cause and effect.
Yeah.
A broken bone doesn't care about your feelings,
Yeah.
and setting a cast doesn't require like a committee consensus.
But then you step out of the hospital, right, and you step into the macro world of civilizational infrastructure and cultural ideology. Suddenly you're taking that x-ray machine and pointing it at the entire electrical grid.
The very foundation of the modern world.
Right. The millions of miles of copper and steel keeping us out of the dark. And the diagnosis we are looking at today makes an incredibly sweeping claim. It basically argues that the grid, and by extension Western civilization, is suffering from a terminal disease.
A terminal disease of ideology, yeah. And a fundamental rejection of the biological realities that built those systems in the first place.
Right. And I want to pause right here and speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
If you are navigating the modern world as a men's rights advocate, or if you identify with red-pilled manosphere spaces, and you feel this profound daily disconnect between the men who build our institutions and the ideologies currently running them.
Which a lot of people do feel right now.
Oh, absolutely. If that's you, this deep dive is custom tailored for you. We are unpacking a perspective that argues exactly why that disconnect exists, tracing the history of our institutions before they were captured by modern cultural movements, and detailing the terrifying physical consequences of that capture.
It is a really thorough architectural mapping of a worldview that many feel, but they struggle to articulate with this level of structural backing.
Yeah, exactly. And as always, to ensure you never miss a deep dive into the ideas shaping our reality, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show. Because today we are undertaking an extensive chapter-by-chapter review of a highly provocative new ebook that is absolutely dominating the cultural conversation right now.
It's everywhere.
It really is. It's called Egalitarian Blackouts: The Deadly Consequence of Unplugging Male Competence by Conrad Riker, published in 2026.
And it is a dense, philosophical, and highly structural argument. I mean, Riker is essentially attempting to unify physics, evolutionary biology, and political history into a single, unbreakable mathematical proof.
Yeah, the hype around this book is intense. To truly see the scale of the historical blueprints Riker is laying out here, you really need to read his raw text. I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it for yourself. It is the kind of book you need to digest firsthand to fully grasp the footnotes and the sheer scope of the argument.
The footnotes alone are wild.
Oh, they're a journey. And you should also follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay plugged into his ongoing commentary. Now, before we descend into the mechanics of Riker's manifesto, we need to establish our operational parameters for this discussion.
Yeah, this is an essential disclaimer for our listener. This source material contains highly politically charged viewpoints regarding gender, Marxism, modern culture, and the biological differences between men and women.
Right.
As your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing these viewpoints.
Exactly. Our sole objective is to impartially report on the contents of the ebook. We are here to help you understand the author's arguments exactly as they're presented in the text, exploring the architecture of his logic without moralizing. We are looking at the blueprint, not signing the building permit.
I like that framing. So to lay out the foundation, Riker posits that the electrical grid operates as what he terms an anti-entropy engine.
Anti-entropy engine.
All right. Entropy, in thermodynamics, is the gradual decline into disorder. Riker argues the natural state of the universe is darkness, cold, and chaos. The electrical grid is a massive, continent-spanning machine holding back that natural state. And his central thesis is that this engine requires constant, ruthless, unapologetic male logic to function.
So you're saying it's not just a machine, it's a gendered concept.
Basically, yeah. According to the text, when society replaces that rigorous, mathematically uncompromising male competence with what he identifies as female-coded egalitarianism.
Meaning prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion over raw capability.
Exactly. When you do that, the physical collapse of the system, becomes mathematically guaranteed.
Wow, okay, so let's wind the clock back to the moment the switch was literally flipped to understand where Riker believes this male logic first manifested at scale, because he points us to a very specific date, right? September 4, 1882.
Yeah, the activation of the Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan by Thomas Edison. This was the first commercial central power plant in the United States.
And Riker doesn't just treat this as a neat milestone in a middle school history textbook. He frames this as an epochal shift in human evolution. He actually calls it the ultimate expression of masculine will.
He does.
So how does he bridge a coal-fired generator in the 1880s to, like, philosophical masculinity?
Well, he connects it directly to the ancient philosophy of Aristotle. Riker leans heavily on the Aristotelian concept of telos.
Telos, the purpose of a thing, right?
Right, the fundamental purpose or the ultimate actualized end of a thing. Like the acorn's telos is the oak tree.
Okay.
Riker argues that the telos of the electrical grid is the absolute unyielding domination of natural limits. It represents a collective of men looking into a dark, chaotic, homicidal void and forcing it into the light through sheer cognitive dominance and physical labor.
And he contrasts this vision violently with the way he claims modern leftists and ecofeminists view history. Like, he spends a significant amount of time attacking what he calls the noble savage fallacy.
Oh, yeah. He argues that modern egalitarian ideologues push a dangerous delusion. They promote this romanticized hallucination that humanity lived in a harmonious, peaceful, spiritually balanced state with nature.
Right, before the Industrial Revolution came along and ruined everything with smokestacks and capitalism.
Exactly. But Riker forces the reader to look at the brutal pre-industrial reality to shatter that hallucination. He brings up the Hobbesian state of nature.
And we are talking about a world where infant mortality routinely hovered between 30 and 40%, right?
Yeah, 30 to 40%. It's staggering. Riker paints this really vivid picture of a reality where a simple scraped knee could lead to fatal sepsis, where waterborne killers like cholera wiped out entire communities without warning, and where winter meant literal starvation and freezing to death.
Right.
His argument is that existence before the grid was exactly what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes described. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Nature wasn't a mother. Nature was an assassin.
That's a heavy line. Nature was an assassin. I noticed he weaves theology into this point as well, specifically St. Augustine's views on the nature of evil.
Yeah, he does. St. Augustine argued that evil is not a substantive, independent force in the universe, but rather a privation of good, literally an absence of light.
Okay.
Riker adopts this both metaphorically and literally. The pre-electric world was a state of permanent privation. The men who built the steam engines blasted through mountains and strung up the copper wires. They didn't just invent convenient tools.
Right. In Riker's framework, they elevated humanity out of the primordial muck through Aristotelian logic and engineering. They waged war on the privation of light.
Exactly.
Which brings us to one of the most provocative concepts in the entire book, and that is the cathode imperative. This is where Riker starts directly mapping human biology onto electrical physics.
Right, so the cathode imperative is Riker's assertion that men are biologically and psychologically hardwired to act as the cathode in society.
And in electrical terms, just as a refresher,
In electrical terms, the cathode is the electrode from which conventional current leaves a polarized electrical device. It is the active source of projection.
okay, I follow.
So Riker argues that the physical routing of electricity, originating from a massive centralized generator and projecting outward into the void to provide heat and motion, that perfectly mirrors the masculine biological imperative.
Oh, wow.
The male drive is to project energy, order, and structure into the family and the state.
So he's basically saying the grid isn't just a machine maintained by men. The grid is male in its very nature. Its architecture is literally a mirror of male evolutionary psychology.
He reinforces this by applying Locke and property rights to the physical infrastructure too.
John Locke, okay?
Yeah, John Locke posited that when a man mixes his physical labor with the raw materials of nature, he creates property. Riker argues the electrical grid is the ultimate macro-scale mixing of human intellect and sweat with natural resources, like coal, copper, water. Therefore, the grid is a distinctly patriarchal property, forged in the fires of the Enlightenment and owned morally by the sex that shed the blood to build it.
And building that patriarchal property required a level of brutality that modern, comfortable society finds, well, highly distasteful today. Riker spends a fascinating chapter on Edison's rivalry with Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, The whole war of the currents thing.
Direct current versus alternating current, yeah.
Now, history often paints Edison as a bit of a villain in this era because of his ruthlessness. But Riker leans into that ruthlessness and kind of flips the moral judgment.
He does.
He actually cites Edison electrocuting animals, including Topsy the elephant, and his push to invent the electric chair. All of which was a calculated PR campaign to prove Westinghouse's alternating current was too dangerous for public use.
Right, thereby securing a monopoly for his own direct current.
And Riker doesn't apologize for this behavior at all.
No, he elevates it to the level of Roman-style civic dominance. Riker's point is that masculine governance, the kind necessary to build an empire, operates on tangible results, the projection of power, and the absolute control of resources. It does not operate on fragile idealism or moral hand-wringing. Edison securing the perimeter for his technology was a matter of civilizational survival in Riker's eyes, much like a Roman general conquering hostile territories to build an aqueduct.
Right.
The ruthlessness was the feature, not the bug, that allowed the grid to exist.
So from an analytical standpoint, I want to drill down into how Riker bridges the gap between human psychology and raw physics. Because I can see the metaphorical overlap, sure, but psychology is notoriously messy, biological, and subjective.
Very much so.
Riker is mapping traits like aggression and spatial dominance directly onto the rigid mathematics of Ohm's law and Kirchhoff's circuit laws. How does the text logically justify linking the fluid nature of human thought to absolute mathematical formulas?
Well, Riker justifies it by arguing there is actually no disconnect between the two. They are different manifestations of the same underlying truth.
How so?
Consider Ohm's law, the fundamental relationship in circuit design. Voltage equals current multiplied by resistance.
Okay.
Riker argues that this formula is the absolute epitome of patriarchal logic. It is entirely objective. It is unyielding. It demands absolute compliance, and it doesn't care about your demographic background.
Right.
His argument is that the male psychological drive for systematization, spatial reasoning, and conquering the physical environment is the biological manifestation of Ohm's law.
So, if I understand the text, the male psychology isn't separate from the physics. The male psychology is the only cognitive architecture capable of executing the physics.
That is his exact claim, yeah. You mentioned Kirchhoff's circuit laws.
Yeah.
Kirchhoff's junction rule states that the total current entering a junction must exactly equal the total current leaving it.
Right, conservation of charge.
Exactly. It is an absolute zero-sum reality. You cannot create energy out of nothing. Riker uses this to argue that the male mind evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to understand zero-sum survival in a hostile environment. You know, if you don't hunt, you starve. Modern egalitarian ideology, he claims, operates on the delusion of infinite resources and infinite forgiveness. Riker writes that you cannot negotiate with a step-up transformer, and you cannot guilt-trip a high-voltage transmission line into working.
Wow.
Only a mind that respects absolute unyielding hierarchies of truth can interface with the laws of electromagnetism.
Which sets up the central conflict of the book. Because if that unyielding, zero-sum mathematical mindset built the grid, what happens when that mindset is systematically removed from the control room?
Exactly.
Riker calls this phenomenon the gynocentric short circuit.
Yeah, and this is where Riker transitions from his historical foundation into analyzing modern catastrophes. He uses the August 14, 2003 Northeast blackout as his ultimate real-world metaphor for this ideological shift.
This was a massive event. 55 million people lost power across the northeastern United States and Ontario. People were literally sleeping on the streets of Manhattan.
265 power plants were forced to shut down in a cascading failure, including 22 nuclear facilities.
I understand the scale of the blackout, but how does Riker logically prove that egalitarianism or a lack of masculine philosophy caused it? Because the official reports blame overgrown trees in Ohio and a software bug.
Right.
How does he bridge a software glitch to a failure of cultural philosophy?
So he digs deep into the timeline of the failure. The software bug was in GE Energy's XA21 alarm system used by First Energy. Because the alarms failed, the operators didn't realize that their heavily loaded transmission lines were heating up, sagging, and arsing into unpruned trees.
Okay.
Riker views this not as a mere technical glitch, but as a fatal failure of unilateral masculine action. He argues that the control room operators were trapped in a modern web of bureaucratic consensus seeking.
They were hesitant to act without absolute confirmation.
Yes, they were terrified of violating protocols, calling the wrong department, or making unilateral decisions to isolate the problem by shedding load.
Shedding load meaning purposely turning off power to some customers to save the wider grid.
Exactly. Riker asserts that true masculine decisiveness would have involved pruning the trees aggressively months earlier, regardless of environmentalist pushback, or acting unilaterally the moment the system behaved erratically. When that decisive instinct is replaced by a desire to appease committees, seek consensus, and avoid offending stakeholders, the grid collapses. The hesitation was the short circuit.
He formalizes this dynamic into a strict syllogism, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. The logical progression is laid out really clearly. Premise A, complex infrastructure requires strict meritocracy and the most ruthlessly capable minds to maintain order against entropy.
Okay.
Premise B, modern egalitarianism mandates outcome-based quotas determined by gender and race, explicitly prioritizing representation over raw competence.
All right.
Therefore, the conclusion, modern egalitarianism structurally undermines and eventually destroys complex technological infrastructure.
And that's where the title comes from, Egalitarian Blackouts. He is arguing that the political demand to lower standards to achieve equal demographic outcomes is an immediate contradiction of physics that guarantees structural failure.
Furthermore, he backs this up by diving heavily into evolutionary psychology to push back against the mainstream narrative that women are kept out of STEM fields by systemic sexism.
Yeah, he relies heavily on the greater male variability hypothesis.
Right, so Riker points to the evolutionary timeline. He argues that men evolved over millennia to navigate vast spatial terrains, calculate ballistic trajectories for hunting, and build complex physical tools. This required developing intense systemic thinking for physical survival. Women, conversely, evolved with an entirely different set of priorities centered around child-rearing, relational intelligence, communal negotiation, verbal acuity, and building social networks.
And he doesn't just offer this as theory, he brings in specific statistical meta-analyses to prove his point.
He cites the landmark 1995 meta-analysis by Boyer, and Bryden. This was a massive undertaking that examined 172 different studies on spatial abilities.
Wow.
Yeah, and the data demonstrated a persistent, significant male advantage in three-dimensional mental rotation tasks. Riker seizes on this, arguing that the ability to mentally rotate a 3D object in space is the exact cognitive skill required to conceptualize complex electrical grids, fluid dynamics, and circuitry.
So his argument is that the relative absence of women in high-voltage electrical engineering isn't evidence of a patriarchal conspiracy keeping them out. It is simply a manifestation of biological preference and innate cognitive architecture.
He takes it a step further, actually, and points out what he considers the hypocrisy of the equity movement. He highlights the physical danger of infrastructural jobs, which he says is completely ignored by the academics pushing for 50-50 gender quotas. He calls it a conspiracy of silence.
Right. He pulls some really sobering data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2022.
Yeah. Electrical power line installers have a fatal injury rate of 20.8 per 100,000 workers. It is an incredibly dangerous, physically brutal profession that is virtually 100% male. Riker's piercing observation here is that men are literally dying of electrocution at the top of freezing telephone poles simply to ensure that the gender studies professors who criticize them have the electoral power to broadcast their theories.
He suggests that acknowledging this disproportionate male sacrifice would completely invalidate the foundational Marxist dialectic, because that dialectic requires framing all men as privileged oppressors and all women as oppressed victims.
The modern ideological project, according to Riker, requires the total erasure of male utility. You cannot maintain the narrative of the patriarchy as an oppressive force if you admit the patriarchy is the only thing keeping the lights on.
I want to challenge Riker's rigid definition of competence here. Let's look at another disaster he brings up, the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion in 1986.
Okay, yeah.
He uses this to further his argument that diverse committees prioritize feelings over physics. The engineers at Morton Thiokol warned against launching in freezing temperatures based on hard O-ring data. But management, worried about PR and political timelines, overruled them, and the shuttle exploded. Riker frames this as bureaucratic consensus overriding masculine engineering, but let's look at strict engineering problem solving. Doesn't complex systems management sometimes require lateral thinking from outside a rigid hierarchy? Like, if the master-apprentice hierarchy develops a blind spot, doesn't it actually need diverse perspectives to catch the error before disaster strikes?
Well, the way Riker constructs his framework, that question fundamentally misunderstands the nature of true competence.
How so?
Riker argues that competence is entirely independent of melanin or gender, but it is not independent of rigor. He posits that a purely meritocratic hierarchy of highly trained, mathematically obsessed men will invariably outperform a demographically balanced committee of mediocre, laterally thinking hires.
So he completely rejects the very premise that demographic diversity yields a cognitive diversity that is useful for hard engineering.
Completely. In his view, the engineers at Morton Thiokol represented the stoic, masculine imperative to obey physical laws regardless of the political cost. The management represented the feminized, consensus-seeking bureaucracy obsessed with optics. Riker argues that true lateral thinking in engineering doesn't come from a roundtable discussion concerned with feelings.
Right.
It comes from a deep, solitary, obsessive master of physics.
Right.
The hierarchy didn't fail because it lacked diversity. It failed because the politicians overruled the patriarchs of physics.
Okay, so if this rigid mathematical hierarchy is functionally superior, how did it lose its grip on the institutions that used to demand mathematical perfection? Because Riker doesn't see this as a sudden engineering failure. He sees it as a covert cultural virus.
Yes.
He dedicates a massive portion of the book to tracing this takeover, identifying what he calls the EMP of toxic femininity.
He uses the analogy of an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, which is a burst of electromagnetic energy that fries the circuitry of electronics.
Right.
He sees feminist and Marxist ideology functioning exactly like a slow-motion EMP on Western institutional circuitry.
I want to expand on the computer virus analogy he uses because it's really illuminating. It's like a Trojan horse. The HR department is installed as a background safety program to protect workers, right? But once inside, it systematically rewrites the core operating system.
Exactly.
It purges the unyielding logic of Ohm's law and replaces it with code that prioritizes the user's emotional comfort over the computer's CPU temperature until the motherboard literally melts down. Where does Riker say this virus originated?
He points directly to the Frankfurt School as patient zero, and specifically zeroes in on Herbert Marcuse's 1955 book, Eros and Civilization.
Now, I am familiar with Marcuse, but how does Riker interpret his work as the source code for destroying the electrical grid? That seems like a leap.
Well, Riker argues that Marcuse looked at the edifice of Western progress. The engines of industry, the mastery of logistics, the rigid schedules required to build infrastructure.
Yeah.
And Marcuse framed that masculine drive for productivity as a form of psychological oppression. Marcuse synthesized Freud and Marx, essentially arguing that the instinctual repression and discipline required to build civilization was a pathology. It alienated man from his natural pleasure-seeking state.
Oh, I see.
According to Riker, Marcuse created a toxic wellspring of resentment against masculine achievement by telling society that the engineer wasn't a hero, but an oppressor demanding unnatural conformity.
So Marcuse writes this theoretical philosophy in 1955. How does Riker trace this idea moving from the ivory tower into the actual power structures and utility companies?
He follows the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci's concept of the long march through the institutions. Gramsci understood that you cannot defeat the engineer on the battlefield of mathematical merit because the math always wins.
Right, you can't argue with voltage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, you must conquer the culture, the media, the universities, and the bureaucracy. You capture the HR department, not the engineering bay.
And Riker points to the 1960s as the legislative turning point that gave this ideological march its legal teeth.
He cites the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While these were presented to the public as righteous rectifications of workplace grievances and racism, Riker argues they were rapidly weaponized by a burgeoning gynocentric bureaucracy to initiate a legal war on pure meritocracy.
The ultimate turning point, though, the moment the virus truly rewrote the operating system in Riker's eyes, is a very specific Supreme Court case.
Yes, the 1971 Supreme Court case, Griggs v. Duke Power Co.
This is a critical piece of his puzzle. How did this specific case work legally, and why does Riker view it as the death knell for competence?
So the Griggs decision fundamentally altered employment law by inventing the concept of disparate impact. Prior to this, Duke Power required employees to pass general intelligence and mechanical aptitude tests to transfer to higher-paying, more complex departments.
Right.
But the Supreme Court ruled against the use of these broad aptitude tests because they resulted in disproportionate failure rates for African-American applicants compared to white applicants. The crucial part of the ruling was that the tests were deemed illegal, even if there was no intentional discrimination by the employer, simply because the outcome was disparate.
Wait, so it made mathematical and logical rigor legally discriminatory if it didn't produce equal demographic results.
Precisely the author's point. Riker asserts that this decision effectively criminalized objective, Aristotelian aptitude testing. Institutions were suddenly legally liable if their rigorous standards resulted in a lack of diversity.
Oh,
They were forced, by the threat of federal lawsuits, to lower the bar to accommodate demographic quotas, making it a statutory offense to demand excellence when mediocrity was demographically required.
and this legal environment gave birth to the modern Human Resources Department. Riker describes HR in incredibly vivid, hostile terms. He calls them parasitic monopolies on friction.
Yeah, he details how HR departments mutated from simple payroll administrators into ideological enforcement wings. Their mandate was no longer to find the best engineer, but to protect the company from disparate impact lawsuits.
Right.
Consequently, they began purging pragmatic, male-coded logic from the hiring and management processes. The stoic, direct, often blunt communication required of male leaders, who must frequently tell people they are mathematically wrong to avoid a physical disaster.
Right, because feelings don't keep power on.
Exactly. That bluntness was relabeled by HR as a microaggression or creating a hostile work environment.
He paints a grim picture of the human toll this psychological warfare takes on men, too. He cites nearly 40,000 male suicides in 2022, and the fentanyl epidemic completely obliterating the working class men in the Rust Belt.
Riker insists we stop viewing these tragedies as isolated public health crises. He frames them as the mathematical manifestation of state-sponsored psychological warfare. The medical-industrial complex, captured by this HR ideology, has decided that the innate biological drive of men to conquer, build, and compete is a disease to be suppressed with SSRIs and therapy, leaving men hollowed out and turning to fentanyl to numb the pain of their own obsolescence.
I am looking at Riker's analysis here, and it's a profound claim. But it raises a huge question about the supposed superiority of the patriarchal system. If the patriarchal systems were so structurally superior, so mathematically absolute, how does the author explain the success of this Marxist takeover?
Right.
Like, how did the superior host let the virus in? If the men who built the grid were so ruthlessly competent, why did they hand the keys to the HR department?
Riker offers a really fascinating explanation for this paradox, which he calls the gynocentric conspiracy of comfort.
Okay.
He argues that it was the very success of the patriarchal grid, the unprecedented safety, the ubiquitous air conditioning, the mass refrigeration that eradicated starvation, the elimination of predators, that created an environment where physical reality was no longer an immediate, daily threat to the average citizen.
Oh, I see. The staggering success of the grid created the psychological conditions for its own subversion.
Exactly. When your daily survival is absolutely guaranteed by invisible machines maintained by unseen men in the middle of the night, the populace becomes soft. They are granted the luxury to obsess over theoretical microaggressions and sociological inequalities because they are entirely insulated from the brutal, freezing realities of thermodynamics. The virus didn't overpower the host in a physical war. It infected the host's psychology through the sheer decadent comfort the host provided.
So we have the theory, the history, and the mechanism of the infection. Let's look at the physical manifestations. Riker provides two major state-level case studies to prove his thesis that the virus is melting the motherboard. He uses California in 2020 and Texas in 2021 as his empirical proofs of the egalitarian blackout.
Let's start with California. August 2020. The state experienced rolling blackouts during a massive heat wave, plunging millions into darkness.
And Riker blames this squarely on what he terms female-coded leftist governance, specifically pointing to legislative mandates rather than engineering failures.
He focuses heavily on California Senate Bill 100, which was signed into law in 2018. This bill mandated that 100% of the state's electricity must come from clean, zero-carbon energy by 2045.
Right.
Riker details the physics of why this was a disaster. To meet these political quotas, the state prematurely shuttered incredibly reliable baseload power plants, specifically natural gas and nuclear facilities like the push to close Diablo Canyon.
Yeah.
They replaced this continuous heavy-duty power with intermittent, unreliable sources like wind and solar.
He also brings up the October 2019 PG&E shutoffs, where the utility intentionally cut power to over 2 million people to prevent wildfires.
Right. Riker argues that the utility executives had effectively outsourced their masculinity to diversity and inclusion initiatives. They spent millions on social equity campaigns and executive bonuses while entirely neglecting the fundamental unglamorous masculine duty of clearing brush and maintaining high-voltage transmission lines in the forests.
He draws a very sharp dichotomy here between two archetypes, the victimized consumer and the rational man.
The victimized consumer is the modern egalitarian. They demand infinite, uninterrupted power to run their server farms, charge their electric vehicles, and cool their offices, while simultaneously voting to dismantle the nuclear and coal infrastructure that makes it physically possible.
Right.
Riker says this is the ultimate female-coded delusion, demanding the outcome without understanding the mechanism. The rational man, conversely, looks at the load balancing equation. He sees that solar panels don't work at 8 p.m. when everyone turns on their AC, and he makes the hard, unpopular decision to keep the natural gas plant burning to maintain the system, regardless of environmental aesthetics or political feelings.
But then Riker points to Texas. Winter Storm Uri in February 2021. The Texas grid, managed by ERCOT, failed catastrophically. Millions literally froze in their homes. Hundreds died.
Yeah, a total collapse.
Now, Texas is a largely deregulated, conservative, free market state. California is heavily regulated and left-leaning. I need some analytical clarity on how Riker reconciles these two completely different civic models failing under the exact same egalitarian blackout thesis.
This is perhaps his most nuanced argument regarding corporate capture. Riker reconciles the contradiction by arguing that the ideological rot has infected the corporate boardroom structure across the board, regardless of the state's political leaning. The mechanism of failure in Texas was different, but the root cause was the same rejection of the masculine imperative.
So deregulation didn't save them from the HR virus.
No, it just changed the symptoms. In California, the state legally mandated the failure through green ideology. In Texas, the corporate entities running the deregulated grid suffered from the same modern complacency. The executives in Texas prioritized short-term financial engineering, stock buybacks, and quarterly profits over robust, stoic, long-term infrastructural resilience.
Right.
They failed to weatherize the natural gas pipelines and power plants because the corporate culture has drifted entirely away from the Roman-style civic duty of guaranteeing structural integrity. They favored the modern, feminized spreadsheet approach to risk management, hoping the storm wouldn't hit rather than building the fortress to withstand it.
The disease is the same. In both cases, the raw masculine imperative to guarantee the physical environment was subordinated to softer priorities. Whether those priorities were environmental ESG scores in California or short-term quarterly bonuses in Texas. And I want to point out his observation about the reaction to the Texas freeze. He notes how quickly the egalitarian urbanites reverted to primal panic, completely dependent on the invisible patriarchal lifeblood of the grid to survive.
And he emphasizes who actually fixed it. When the grid collapsed and the spreadsheets failed, it wasn't intersectionality theorists or diversity consultants who restored civilization.
Right.
It was blue-collar men working grueling 48-hour shifts in sub-zero conditions, driving snowcats through blizzards, and repairing high-voltage substations with frozen hands to save a society that actively despises them.
We have spent a lot of time on the macro scale here. Electrical grids, Supreme Court cases, institutional capture. But Riker doesn't leave the reader there. He makes a fascinating pivot, taking all of these macro thermodynamic concepts and bringing them right into the individual man's living room. He moves from the infrastructure of the state to the infrastructure of the family.
He introduces a psychological concept he calls the double bind of vulnerability, which serves as the micro equivalent of the egalitarian blackout.
This is a massive cultural touchstone right now. You can't open a magazine or watch a talk show without hearing that society demands men open up, be vulnerable, cry, and express their deepest emotional traumas to their partners.
Right, but Riker argues this modern therapeutic advice is a deadly relationship-ending trap based on a total misunderstanding of evolutionary psychology. He claims that female hypergamy,
Meaning the evolutionary biological drive for a woman to seek a strong, capable protector to ensure the survival of her offspring.
exactly. He claims that hypergamy is hardwired to aggressively punish men for displaying the very vulnerability that modern culture demands of them.
And he brings in hard sociology to back this up, not just internet theories.
He cites a comprehensive 2015 American Sociological Association study led by Michael Rosenfeld, which analyzed relationship dynamics and found that wives initiate nearly 70% of all divorces.
Wait, 70%?
Nearly 70, yeah. And Riker emphasizes that the primary driver cited in these divorces isn't physical abuse or infidelity. It is a vague sense of emotional dissatisfaction or feeling that the man is no longer leading the household.
And Riker shares a very specific, devastating anecdote to illustrate exactly how this trap is sprung.
He details the case of a 42-year-old mid-level corporate manager. Following all the cultural advice of the modern era, this man decided to be vulnerable. He opened up to his wife about his crippling workplace anxiety, his fear of impending layoffs, and his general feelings of inadequacy. According to Riker's analysis, the result was instantaneous. The physical intimacy in the marriage evaporated overnight. 2 months later, the man was served with divorce papers.
Wow.
Furthermore, his therapeutic confession was weaponized against him in family court, with his wife's lawyers framing his normal, understandable stress as dangerous emotional instability to limit his custody.
So Riker's argument is that the moment the woman saw her supposed protector break down and cry, her ancient evolutionary programming kicked in. She subconsciously recategorized him not as a capable mate, but as a fragile dependent.
Riker writes that the modern myth of the sensitive, emotionally transparent man collapses instantly under the ruthless, unforgiving lens of Darwinian evolution. Biology doesn't care about the HR department's guidelines on feelings.
So we have this trap. What is Riker's solution for the individual man who is trying to survive in this bind? How does he protect his family without short-circuiting his marriage?
He offers a solution he calls the Stoic Vault, relying once again on electrical metaphors. He introduces the concept of dielectric insulation.
I really love how he uses physics analogies to explain psychological states. Explain dielectric insulation.
So dielectric insulation is the physical, non-conductive material, like rubber or cross-linked polyethylene, that wraps around a high-voltage copper wire. Its sole purpose is to prevent the immense energy inside the wire from arcing outward and causing a catastrophic short circuit or fire. Riker argues that a man's emotional restraint, his stoicism, is the psychological insulation protecting his family from the brutal, high-voltage terror of the cosmos.
So the man must construct an internal psychological fortress. Let me throw another physics analogy at this. It sounds like Riker is saying a man's role is to be a human Faraday cage.
Oh, exactly.
He takes all the lightning strikes of reality on the outside, the stress of the economy, the physical danger, the existential dread, and he conducts that voltage into the ground so that the inside of the cage, the domestic sphere of his wife and children, remains perfectly calm and safe. They never feel the lightning.
That is a highly accurate representation of his philosophy. A man must be completely walled off from the female sphere when it comes to his deepest anxieties. Stripping his emotional insulation to be vulnerable, according to Riker, results in a catastrophic short circuit that burns his legacy and his family structure to the ground.
But I have to ask about the mechanics of this. Riker is essentially arguing that emotional suppression is not a toxic pathology, but a civic and patriarchal duty. But a Faraday cage doesn't hold the energy, it grounds it. The energy has to go somewhere. What does the author suggest men do with the immense, crushing psychological load that builds up inside that stoic vault? If he can't talk to his wife, where does he ground the wire?
Riker's answer lies in action and the concept of the male guild. He argues the psychological load isn't supposed to be vented in the modern therapeutic sense of crying on a couch. It is supposed to be used.
Used how?
That anxiety is raw fuel. It is converted into the kinetic energy of building, working, lifting weights, and conquering the physical environment. Furthermore, he emphasizes the absolute necessity of male camaraderie, trusted male mentors, brothers, and peers.
The male guild.
Right. The male guild is a space where raw, unfiltered reality can be discussed and processed without triggering the hypergamous revulsion he claims exists in romantic relationships. The grounding wire is the brotherhood of other highly competent men.
Which perfectly transitions us to the final and perhaps most controversial portion of the book, reclaiming the reactor. This is where Riker stops diagnosing the problem and lays out his actionable playbook for the listener.
He outlines a strategy he calls the tactical bypass.
Step 1 of this bypass is what he calls the strike.
Riker demands that competent, rational men simply cease participating in systems that actively punish their competence to reward what he calls pathological narcissism and mediocrity.
Wait, is he telling his readers to just quit their corporate jobs and walk into the woods?
Not necessarily to abandon society, but to systematically withdraw the surplus value of their masculine effort from institutions captured by HR departments. Stop volunteering for the extra committee. Stop offering the brilliant solution that will be credited to a diversity hire.
Okay.
Do the absolute minimum legally required by the captured institution to collect the paycheck, and save your true creative and physical energy for your own endeavors.
Which leads to step 2, shadow networks.
Because the corporate world and the universities are fully captured, Riker says men must operate completely outside of them. They need to form localized parallel hierarchies, strictly patriarchal microcultures within technical fields, trades, and businesses, where merit, logic, and objective physical achievement are the only currencies of respect.
He wants a total return to the master-apprentice dynamic, and he reaches all the way back to the Italian Renaissance to explain the mechanics of how this should work.
Yeah, he uses the historical example of Andrea del Verrocchio, a master sculptor and painter in Florence in the 1460s, who took in a young, illegitimate, uneducated boy named Leonardo da Vinci.
And he spends a lot of time contrasting Verrocchio's workshop with the modern university system.
He attacks the modern university violently. He calls the university industrial complex a systemic scam, artificially bloated by the 1965 Higher Education Act, which guaranteed student loans. He describes the modern campus as an estrogen-laden, artificially safe environment designed specifically to trap young men in decades of financial debt, while indoctrinating them with ideological guilt for being male.
So how does Verrocchio's method differ from a modern college syllabus?
Well, Riker points out that Verrocchio didn't hand young Da Vinci a syllabus on critical theory or ask him about his feelings regarding the marble. He made him draw eggs.
Drawing eggs?
Just drawing eggs. For months, over and over again, until the mathematics of light, shadow, and geometry were physically beaten into Da Vinci's nervous system through friction and repetition.
Wow.
Riker asserts that true knowledge in the patriarchal tradition is not passively memorized from a sterile textbook. It is stolen through observation, friction, and physical pain under the watchful, unforgiving eye of a master.
This intense focus on the physical leads directly into Riker's war on what he calls the sedentary circuit and the soy boy morphology.
Riker draws a direct biological connection between physical atrophy and susceptibility to leftist ideological possession.
He references Theodore Roosevelt's famous 1899 speech on the strenuous life.
Yes, Roosevelt argued against the life of sloth and ease, promoting toil and effort. Riker adopts this, arguing that pure intellectualism without physical vigor creates an empty, impotent skull. He claims that the modern climate-controlled cubicle environment deliberately removes the physical necessity of male competence.
Why?
To ensure ideological compliance. A physically weak male, entirely dependent on the corporate structure for his food and shelter, is biologically incapable of rebelling against institutionalized victimhood.
So, in Riker's view, simply hitting the gym and lifting heavy weights is an act of ideological defiance against the state.
In his framework, optimizing the male physical machine is an absolute prerequisite for optimizing the male mind to resist the hive mind. You cannot build a shadow network if you cannot physically defend it.
He also attacks the media's portrayal of physical competence, pointing out a phenomenon he calls Hollywood's dumb plumber trope.
He views this as a calculated cultural conspiracy. Look at any sitcom or movie from the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Hollywood consistently portrays tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, mechanics as low IQ buffoons with tool belts.
Yeah, that's true.
Riker argues this is deliberate programming designed to hide the staggering incomes, the freedom, and the raw societal power held by master electricians, linemen, and pipe fitters from young, impressionable men. The leftist intelligentsia wants young men to believe the builder is a fool, so they will gladly take on $80,000 in debt for a gender studies degree, rather than joining a union and learning to master the grid itself.
I want to engage with the actual practicality of this tactical bypass for the listener who might be nodding along. If a listener wants to implement these shadow networks, how does Riker suggest they navigate the incredibly dense legal realities of modern corporate governance? For instance, he attacks OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. He claims it legislated away male greatness by sanitizing risk and removing the danger that forges great men. But a shadow network of electricians still has to abide by federal OSHA regulations, or they go to federal prison. How does he reconcile his philosophy with the legal reality?
Riker acknowledges this legal minefield. His advice isn't to recklessly break the law and go to jail, but to aggressively reject the spirit of the sanitization within the cultural boundaries you can control.
Okay.
He argues that true safety on a job site doesn't come from filling out an HR diversity checklist or watching a corporate video before climbing a utility pole. True safety comes from a sharp mind, a competent hand, and a rational, unbroken hierarchy of command, enforced ruthlessly by a master tradesman.
So you follow the law, but you reject the culture.
Exactly. He urges men to form LLCs, businesses, and guilds that comply legally with safety standards, but culturally reject the therapeutic, HR-driven mindset. You clip your harness in to avoid the OSHA fine, but you train your apprentices with the unforgiving, results-oriented rigor of Verrocchio.
Yeah.
You build a culture of absolute mathematical meritocracy within the hollowed-out shell of the regulated state. You starve the parasitic system by refusing to validate its false premises internally, even if you are forced to navigate its paperwork externally.
This has been an incredibly dense, staggering journey through Riker's manifesto. We've traced his view of the grid from Edison's patriarchal triumph and the ruthless physics of alternating current, all the way to the modern egalitarian blackouts of California and Texas.
Yeah.
We've walked through the Frankfurt School's virus, the evolutionary double bind of modern relationships, and finally, his intense physical blueprint for a masculine reclamation of the infrastructure.
It is an undeniably comprehensive worldview.
Yeah.
Riker has attempted to unify the laws of physics, evolutionary biology, historical warfare, and modern ideology into a single, unbreakable mathematical proof about the nature of civilization.
And to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to chew on that builds on Riker's text, but pushes it into the rapidly approaching future. Riker argues that the grid is the ultimate physical manifestation of masculine intellect, requiring human men with their specific evolutionary psychology and testosterone-driven spatial awareness to maintain its anti-entropy engine.
Yes, his entire premise relies on the idea that biological male competence is the irreplaceable cathode of society.
But as we enter an age where artificial intelligence, a system fundamentally devoid of biology, devoid of gender, lacking testosterone, and immune to psychological double binds, begins to fully automate grid management, structural engineering, and load balancing, what happens to Riker's thesis?
It's a great question.
Will an AI management system solidify the Marxist blackout Riker fears by totally removing the biological male hand from the switch? Or will an AI simply enforce the cold, absolute Aristotelian logic of physics Ohm's law, Kirchhoff's laws, that Riker claims is exclusively patriarchal? If an AI runs the grid perfectly without an ounce of human empathy, is that the ultimate victory of Riker's philosophy? Or does it render the biological male obsolete?
That is the precise, terrifying philosophical horizon this text points toward. When the machine no longer needs the patriarch to run the math, what is the telos of the man?
It's something to deeply consider as you look at the infrastructure around you today. Now, to truly arm your rational mind with the full context, the history, and the extensive citations of these arguments, you absolutely must read the text yourself. The excerpts and concepts we discussed today only scratch the surface of his historical and logical proofs.
The depth of his research into the physics of the grid and the legal history of institutional capture requires a close reading.
So open up a new tab right now. Search for Egalitarian Blackouts by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks and buy it today. It is essential reading for anyone trying to understand this cultural moment. And make sure to stay plugged into the author's ongoing commentary. You can follow @Conrad Riker on Substack, where he expands on these ideas weekly.
The conversation he's sparking is only going to get louder as the infrastructure continues to age.
And finally, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive into the ideas that are shaping our world. Until next time, remember, the X-ray is pointing right at the grid. The question is, who is going to have the competence to read the scan?